Hello, everyone. Fiona Robertson returns to the podcast to talk about her latest book, The Dark Night of the Soul, a journey from absence to presence. Fiona is referring to the archetypal experience of entering a period of darkness and despair during a process of spiritual awakening. We talk about our own dark nights, our emergence from them back into the light, and how we've come to relate to the traditionally more troubling aspect of our psyches. For me, this interview was one of the most personally insightful ones I've recorded, provoking self-reflection whilst it was still in progress, and I hope it's similarly so for you. I start off by asking Fiona why she chose to write a book about the dark night as opposed to the sunny afternoon of the soul.
In essence, I think I wrote the book that I needed when I was going through the dark night of the soul, and that wasn't around. I think, as you say, lots of people write about the sunny afternoon of the soul, the sunny morning of the soul, and in a sense that's easy, isn't it? Often spirituality is selling us happiness or calm or peace, and yet for so many of us, actually, when things begin to open out, we experience completely the opposite. We experience everything that we've previously avoided or suppressed. So I think it's really important that we talk about the reality of that. Certainly for me, I thought there was something really wrong with me, that I was going through that. There was a lot of shame and a lot of hiding around that. And I know a number of people experience that. So it seems really important to say, it's not, there are 24 hours in the day, so to speak. This isn't about finding a place of happiness or calm or sunniness and staying there. It's also about experiencing everything else,
And
the other side to that.
I take it that's not what you expected when you stepped into spirituality. That you did expect more sunniness sort of out the darkness, or didn't expect maybe the intensity of the darkness, and that came as a surprise then.
I think for me, spirituality at that point in my life had really taken a back seat. I was more interested in a slightly different facet of it, really. We could call it healing, or looking for some kind of cure, the holy grail of cure that would make me okay. And so I wasn't involved in any overt spiritual practice or exploration around spirituality. I had been at various points in my life before that, but at that point it wasn't what was going on. So in that sense, I didn't have any expectations, particularly, other than, I say, this desire for some sort of, I think, like many of us have, some sort of magic bullet or miracle cure. The intensity of what happened was deeply and profoundly shocking. Yeah, absolutely. And I was really fortunate in the sense that I recognized within a few weeks what was going on. So even though that didn't make it any less intense, it didn't change the experience of it, I did recognize that this was a soul issue, and I picked up along the way that this phrase, dark night of the soul,
Mm.
and recognized what was happening to me as that.
So can I just clarify that you had been interested in spirituality, but you were looking more for what you describe it as a cure for more of the psyche at the time. And you're like putting spirituality in one box and the more sort of psyche stuff in another. Is that what I'm being right?
Yeah, I mean, the route that I was traveling down at that point was more to do with healing, so
Right.
complementary therapies and psychotherapeutic work and so on, rather than, and I get that you could see those all as part of
Sure.
spirituality, but I wasn't, for example, doing much meditation, or
Oh, okay.
and I'd played around with that in the past, but I'd never been particularly good at it, actually. I didn't, and that's how I would have seen it at that point.
Okay, no, it's interesting. I'm just like looking for patterns in these things because I think
Right.
my first 3 or 4 years of interest in this whole world, lumping it all together, was very much on the pure meditative leap over all the psyche and all its problems and go to the center stuff. And I didn't really have any problems then. Like life just got better and better, right? And it was when I decided that maybe I'd gotten as much value as I could for that from now, and actually there was a lot of stuff in my psyche which was maybe more restrictive, and I sort of put that stuff down and went into the psyche. That's when the real darkness opened up for me. So I'm just interested in the kind of parallel there. Maybe there's something
Yeah,
archetypal about that.
I think there probably is something archetypal about it. Yeah, I mean, from my experience and from talking with and working with many people, I think for me there was something about certain things in my life coming together in retrospect quite a miraculous way, or quite an interesting way in many ways, that allowed the falling apart to happen.
Hmm.
Because I think even though I had been doing the inner work, the psychological work in various ways over many years, what happened in the dark night was of a completely different order to that. So I think on some level it did help that I had done prior work, but it didn't change the dark night in that
Sure, no,
sense.
I would say the same thing. I always felt like I'd acquired just enough stability in the stuff I did prior to that to survive it and be able to engage with it. And it didn't like,
Yeah,
in it, I felt like, no, I've really gone too far, right? I've really gone too far. I'm not going to come through this. But I had,
yeah,
if without having that prior stuff, I either wouldn't have been able to go into it. I just wouldn't have been able to tolerate the torment of the psyche that much. Or if I had gone into it, I wouldn't have been able to do anything with regard to moving through it. So it did feel
yes.
like there was some deeper intelligence that knew when the right time was to open these things up.
Definitely, that's my sense of it, and often, of course, it doesn't feel like that when you're in it. I mean, the very notion of there being some deeper intelligence involved, often, I think, we would look at the mess of the dark night and go, well, that can't possibly be the case. My sense is that there was some part of us knows what's possible. And it does feel like there is some kind of intelligent orchestration to it on some level.
What was your journey through it like then? Because I think again with archetypal patterns, we see a kind of like often a resistance to it, like this isn't going to happen to me. I'm not going to fall into this dark chasm, and then I want
Yeah.
out of here as soon as possible. Something's gone wrong. I've got to get rid of this and get back to the light. And then a slow coming round to, oh, actually, maybe there's something a little bit interesting. Oh, actually, this is quite interesting. And then a real engagement with the darkness, if the journey is like a healthy one, okay, that it has those steps. So, does, what was your experience like?
Yeah. Well, you just beautifully described it, basically. I mean, the first part was very much the desperate clinging on. So that sense of, I can't, to let go will be catastrophic. So lots of terror, huge amounts of anguish, um, a lot of deep, deep suffering. And then just to say that whole notion of letting go, I think in the dark night isn't something that we can just do. We can't just decide to stop resisting, because it's all happening at if you like, below the level of our will, or our yeah, we can't decide to just do that by act of will. But I think there is something about the willingness to do that 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 can come into play, where at some point we find ourselves on our knees, either actually or metaphorically, just saying, okay, you know I'm giving it over, I'm
Hmm.
handing it over. I simply can't do this anymore. I can't do this by myself. And in that, I think, is the willingness to start to even be curious about it slightly. I mean, certainly for me, I came to realize that there were aspects of the darkness that I actually liked in some way, and felt good to my body actually, even though my mind was really not into the idea at all. What finally came about was that my body felt some degree of relief in the darkness when I was just able to really settle into that.
Yeah, I think it's almost like there has to be an exhaustion of fighting against it, right? And you have to try
Completely.
every option 3 times over before we go,
Yeah,
okay, that everything I can do hasn't worked.
absolutely. I mean, I think that's the crucial aspect of it. Exactly that the surrender, if we want to call it that, comes through sheer exhaustion.
Hmm. And then there's a letting go of like fighting against, right? Because for me,
Yeah,
after about a year, like I had to accept maybe this depression isn't going to lift, right? And maybe I'm going to be like having this forever now, right? Which is a strange thought because I'd always thought I'd find a way through it and be victorious, right? And come out of it.
yeah,
But only in that acceptance could I stop wanting to get it to go away and then look, well, what is it actually? And why is it here? To kind of form a kind of marriage
yeah.
with it then and take an interest in.
Absolutely. I love how you said, at some point you stop trying to be victorious,
Hmm.
because I think that's very much the model that we tend to be in, isn't it? That's a we're supposed to fight in some way. We're supposed to overcome things. So many aspects of culture tell us, don't they? And I think therefore to move into it, to accept it, is countercultural, really, isn't it? To
Hmm. Yeah.
say, no, I'm not going to try and defeat this, A, because defeat is impossible and I'm completely exhausted, but B, maybe there's something in this, maybe there is something rich or precious or intelligent about this.
Yeah. I continue to question my relationship with that striving for victory, that willfulness, if you like. I continue to question the good and the bad role that the will plays in
Yeah,
my life. So I don't want to jump into then, okay, the will didn't work, therefore the will is bad. Because I think that people
yeah,
who achieve
definitely.
anything, produce anything, create anything, you read the biographies, there's a lot of will in there, but the
Yeah,
will can only, I think, go so far, and there has to be something else come in then. And I suppose, and I wonder what you think about this, I've noticed the opposite polarity too, of when I say surrender, I don't mean a kind of apathetic surrender of, okay, I'm just going to like lie in bed all day and go, oh, it's awful. It's a kind of
completely.
focused surrender. I'm just making up
It
words in this way, but
totally. I mean, I really recognize what you're saying about that. I mean, in the book, I describe it as, it's not a supine surrender. It isn't just a, okay, I give up, like you say. There's something actually um, more intelligent and almost more noble about it. I mean, I don't mean to sort of make it into its own thing by saying noble, but there is something about recognizing that that whole narrative of being victorious actually misplaces us. That we're not, to understand our position in relation to big life things is to surrender into reality, actually, my senses, rather than, yes, as we imagine, a kind of giving up, or it's a very different, I think there's a grace in that surrender.
yes. And you can't really be victorious over a part of yourself, right? So
Yeah,
the idea of being victorious, um, it has this dualistic that it's coming from a place of like good and evil, right? And
yeah,
absolute rights and wrongs.
yeah,
And I'm not saying there's no context in life where that's appropriate, but it really wouldn't make sense to say like you were victorious over your partner in your marriage, right? Because like what, and it's obvious that but it plays out in different ways, like in community conflicts. Okay,
Yeah,
like you've got like what went on in the north of Ireland or something. Attempts that you've got to you're going to have to live with these people in the end, right? And attempts to be victorious over them. There's something obviously not going to work out well. For our own darkness and struggles, we do culturally classify as like that's the bad bit of life. That's where the brain chemistry's gone out of balance, and we need to be, overcome, right, and get rid of. And I
yeah,
think when I think about like any work I've done in this area with people, I would say, like, if I was to write down some of the core things that are the most helpful that people have constantly fed back to me, is the helping people to reclassify what's going on in themselves as not being a bad thing, right? As being like, we have a certain image of what the human journey is, and it's very much tied up in like quantities of happiness, right? So if I'm a functional human being, I should feel happy all the time, and I should feel positive about life, and I shouldn't be wrought with questions of anxiety, whether it's about the nature of the universe or my appearance or anything else. Like, because anxiety can play itself out in very philosophical ways, it can play itself out in very mundane ways, but it's
yes.
a core anxiety playing out, and that's a bad thing, right? And then I look on Facebook, and my 500 friends all seem to be doing better than that, So I'm like, I'm failing here. Um,
Yeah,
but to reimagine the world, it's like, well, and it's quite simple to do, because if you look at any sort of like film or work of literature, it's always involving a lot of darkness, right? Like, you don't have films where it starts off nice, goes reasonably well in the middle, and ends up better. It's like there's always like, it's always, the hero is always taken to the edge and beyond in a good drama. But we don't think of our own lives that way. Like, our stories reflect that it is that way, but we don't allow that in this world.
absolutely. I mean, I'm smiling for anybody who's listening to this, because I love what you just said. My sense is that that notion of happiness or positivity has assumed almost cult-like proportions. And I think there's all sorts of reasons for that, to do with our economies and the way that society works, that we're sold this notion of having to be positive and happy. And I think that assigns all kinds of very natural, important human experiences and feelings into into the shadow, if you like. They're considered to be negative, and we should be able to overcome them. And I think there's a huge mistake in that. That all of those feelings are a very important part of being human, and that if we suppress them, we're suppressing our aliveness. So even though on the surface it might look like everything's great, if there is any suppressing going on of rage, anger, sadness, fear, whatever it happens to be, there will be some kind of deadness or sense of uh, deadness or numbness going on.
Yeah, and I think we can maybe see it in other people. Okay, so the person that jumps into mind often of this is Viktor Frankl,
Mm,
the
yeah,
psychotherapist, Jewish psychotherapist who was put in a concentration camp, endured unimaginable suffering, and emerged out of it with this psychotherapeutic theory about uh, meaning, and how life isn't to find our own happiness, but to find our own meaning. And we
yeah.
can look at the life of someone like that, or the life of someone who's maybe done something wonderful in history, and see how their suffering was an integral part of their journey. And perhaps they wouldn't want it to be taken away from them, even though it's unimaginable. But we don't maybe give ourselves that kind of credit, that our suffering could have something important, right? So if I'm feeling rage or anger or depression, it's like, that's because I'm defective. It's not because, there's some great wisdom inside me, which is coming out in this difficult way when unacknowledged. And I think it's good when people can say that about, like, oh, because there is almost feeling like, if I'm struggling with mental health issues or something, and it's affecting my performance at work or in my family, right, then that makes me like a defective member of society. I'm not pulling my weight, not that my darkness has some virtue to offer both myself and the wider world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the most profound changes that happens through the course of the Dark Night. in my experience, and I don't know if it was the same for you, that we move from that model of assuming our own defectiveness into an understanding that actually there's far more in our pain than we imagined. You know, that when we're able to explore that willingly, willingly or unwillingly, actually it happens either way, but when we're able to explore that, we do discover what we didn't realize before we explored, that there is something really precious in that. And I think that sense of meaning can't be underestimated. I mean, that's so profound, isn't it? When we have those moments of understanding or realization or clarity about the deeper meaning of what it is to be here. You know, what it is to exist, and what it is to exist as ourselves. You know, the particularity of ourselves that now for me completely outweighs any notion of happiness. You know, I would choose that now over and over again. And certainly, having talked to many people who've been through the dark night, everybody unfailingly says the same thing, that given the choice, they would absolutely go through it again for what came out of it. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's a shifting of happiness outside of being the central virtue of life and replacing it with something like meaning or depth. Okay, because there's,
Yeah,
and obviously, that gives a different kind of happiness. There's like, I guess, the word happiness covers different and not things that aren't quite the same. Like there's a kind of superficial happiness is very nice, okay, when things are going well, but there's a deep rooted sense of contentment that can exist when things are very difficult, but
yeah.
you feel like you're engaging something. And I think that contentment gets lost when you don't see meaning in the difficulties arising. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because obviously without meaning, then the pain is simply painful, isn't it? I mean,
Hmm.
unremittingly awful.
Like one that I've heard people say in a lot of ways, I've had myself, and I've heard people say in a lot of ways, is death. Okay, so our culture, I think we cope with death by not thinking about it very much, right? As a culture, and I've had a lot of people say the same thing to me in different ways. So I'll pick one example, which was I remember being told by a lady once about how she was in a nightclub dancing, having a really good time, and suddenly was just hit by this realization that her and everyone around her, these youthful, vibrant bodies, in 100 years' time would all be dead, and actually everyone in the world would be dead in 100 years' time. And she like literally sat down and cried. But what's accompanying this crying is a sense of like, what's wrong with me, right? That everyone else is capable of going out dancing, having a good time, and I have to think about like everyone dying, right? There's like something just like I've got a demon in my head or something. And it's of course like this is the story of the Buddha, right? It's like when he leaves the palace where everything is perfect and he sees suffering, sickness, and death is like the final straw for him. It's the invitation to think, well, wow, if everything is impermanent, what's permanent? Where is meaning in a world where everything falls away? And people are having
Absolutely.
continuously arising these opportunities. The darkness is opening up as a portal to depth, but we don't know that, right? So it's, oh, there's something wrong with me, so I'm not going to stay up. I'm going to try and like put that back, medicate that away or something. And I guess you encounter similar things with people.
Very much so. Yeah. We live in such a culture of denial, don't we? You know, there's huge denial of death, huge denial of pain and suffering, depending on how it's presenting itself. So I think it's natural that we would feel there's something wrong with us when we somehow go against that culture of denial. But actually, I think there's something right with us when we do that. Not that that feels okay necessarily, but I think there's something in it that is searching for, as you were saying, for depth and for meaning. And without really coming to grips, without coming out of that denial, without coming to grips with the fact that as as the woman you described said, we're all going to die. How do we place life really if we're in denial of death? You know, for me that was a big issue in the Dark Knight. And death was 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 huge as part of the Dark Knight. Not only because it felt like I was going to die, that I couldn't possibly survive what was coming up, but just the consciousness of death as a current in life became really profound.
So let me ask you, like, what's your continued relationship with the Dark Knight now? Okay, in the
Mm,
there's a period where it's very intense. Okay, I think for both of
yeah.
us, and then, well, for me, there's a conclusion to that which is quite dramatic. And it's like in the space of an evening, night and day. Like I saw what I hadn't seen before, and I came out of like my depressive darkness. Okay, and then I started to figure out why that had happened, why I've been able to make this transition, because the transition does occur, right? So, I'm just saying before how like it's when I accepted it and thought, okay, maybe we're going to be like friends forever, you and I. We're going to have to go through life together, so we better start to understand each other. Well, yes, but then that attitude does cause a change, right? And I think initially what I noticed is there's a grasping of that change. Then it's like, oh, I start to understand. Now I can get rid of you. It's like I've got an angle and I can
Yeah.
poke you from here. And then the more I stop trying to get rid, the more there is a movement and a transition. But then other things, I suppose, open up. And I suppose maybe a challenge for me is to not consider the Dark Knight complete almost, but hold it open and say like, yeah, but there's a continuous arising of like difficult experiences, and even though there is also within that like a transition from darkness to light. So how do you
Yeah.
conceive how that continues post like the depth of it?
Yeah. I mean, for me, there was a gradual emerging, a gradual transitioning out of the intensity of it. So I didn't have quite the sort of stark contrast that you described.
Mm,
And I totally recognize what you say about the grasping. I think it's interesting, isn't it, that there's that part of us that will come in and try and manipulate everything to be able to still
mm,
hold on to its turf, as it were. And I think as we move out to the intense phase, that continues in all sorts of different ways, doesn't it? I'd say that there's something about becoming so deeply familiar with the dark, which means that we don't feel that we have to push it away as we once did in the same way. So it doesn't feel to me like we go into that and then we somehow emerge into the light and that's it. I think we're much more in the natural cycles then of light and dark as they appear in our own lives, and obviously as we know they appear every day in every season in nature. So I think there's something about almost learning the language of the darkness that we then have as a capacity or capability as life continues. So when the darkness comes back round again,
mm.
we know that place. You know, we know the language, and so it isn't it isn't problematic in the same way that it once was. So there's something for me about dwelling in both places. I mean, in the
Mm,
book I talk about the myth of Persephone and her abduction into the underworld by Hades, and then subsequently her going underground for several months of the year
mm.
afterwards. And I think there's something rich and important in that notion of being able to be in both.
Yeah, because I think it's a bit that can catch people out, right? Because I can tell a great story about my recovery from depression, and it's all true, but the challenge that can present then is a one say, okay, yeah, so I overcame, right? And for people who then have maybe a career based in therapy or spirituality, in the sense of like, yeah, I'm selling my time, my book to you based on my competence, that I had that and now I don't, because I can. So
Yeah.
in a sense, happiness has remained the central virtue, but it's just like, yeah, I had a difficult experience, overcame it, and now I'm.
Yeah.
And I think it can be a challenge, because what I noticed and like didn't open up in me is not that move just towards positivity. What I would say opened up was a greater capacity for depth, both in terms of the light and the dark. So sticking with the death example, like I see people like write things about death, like, oh, it doesn't bother me anymore, right? Because I recognize I'm that transcendent spirit within. So, why would I be bothered by death? And it's like, I feel like, well, good for you, but that's not my experience of it, right? I have that of like having a more intense okayness with death and more of an acceptance of it, because I can connect with that part of myself. But I can also open up a far more intense realization of it, like in doing things like the Buddhist meditation on the dying corpse. I've done that, but I've also opened up my imagination a lot. So I've one night spontaneously had an experience of my own death, right? Well, it's happened a few times, but one I really saw myself being an old man and dying, and like, that's horrifying, right? And it was horrifying for that to me. And I'm also much more aware of the darkness and the terror of like, we're going over this cliff, we don't really know where, we don't know, and that lives in me too, right? And I think without that, I would be very disconnected from people, very disconnected.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you just, I mean, I love everything you just said, but I think I see such a tendency to disconnect in what you described about, you know, I encounter there are so many books and teachings based on that formula,
Hmm.
aren't there? As you say, I encountered this, I got my way through it. Here's my methodology. Here's what I'm selling, and now it's all fine. And I think that is so disconnected. You know, I think there's something profoundly um, troubling about that kind of formula, because of the pain and shame it gives rise to in everybody else who encounters that, who doesn't experience that. I think as somebody who's written a couple of books, and obviously one about the Dark Knight, it was so important to me to that wasn't my message. That my message was, here's my experience. Your experience is every bit as valid as any piece of mine, and the Dark Knight and everything else lives on in me in a dynamic and changing way. So I can't possibly say, it can't be pinned to a singular event. So just as one example, I can remember one week, on the Monday, I had a really profound experience of letting go into love taking everything from me, and yeah, a really deep immersion in that. On the Wednesday, I had a really profound experience of a deep sense of unforgiveness. Um, and how can we possibly judge that, other than to say that both exist and both are equally valid in the moment that they're
Hmm.
here? So just as you say, my experience of death, for example, is both some profound experiences around the nature of it and the profound beauty of it, and also equally profound experiences of the terror of it. So I think for us collectively to move out of this story of basically, I encountered, I overcame, and here's what I'm selling as a result of it, it is really important, because I think that's a deeply unhealthy paradigm.
Yeah, and I can see it's something I struggle with in myself, right? Because that story, if I tell it about myself that I had depression, then I did this thing, then I didn't. That's not untrue, right? because,
Sure.
and you could look at my behavior and just see like, oh yeah, like prior to this, Richard was like, he was lying in bed and he was finding it very difficult to get up, and he was like miserable, and then this day, and then after that, it's like this. And so, well, yeah, if you're looking at it in a clinical way, and that is worth noting, because if someone's struggling with that and they feel like despondent and hopeless, say, look, people have this and then they don't, right? And there's value in that.
Definitely.
But I
Yes.
think, even like, and I mean, about 12 years later now, more, it's something I'm still questioning myself, because I have to acknowledge that I've never had a good connection with people with depression since then, right? Because it's almost like I've cut myself off from that a bit, and things that have remained more of a struggle for me, I've been much more relational with people, and that's not, I'm not sure that's a good thing, right? And there is almost a sense of like, well, I wonder if I've been a bit like too much there, because it was such a big struggle. When it ended, I wanted to push it away a bit and say, no, I don't have that, and almost like an
Yeah.
inviting back in of that depression, and saying, actually, the willingness, or the being overcome by a sense of, oh, what's the point, is actually a part of the human condition too, right? And it's not that we want to get rid of that altogether. There are times in life that make you go, God, I can't see a light at the end of this tunnel, and
Yeah.
I think maybe that's something I've disconnected from in myself, and had a not an entirely comfortable relationship with, because maybe it was so overwhelming at the time that I was really glad to think that's behind me, so that's something I'm having to think about reintegrating.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of it is that that process of integrating and reintegrating is ongoing, and I think we we need a certain amount of vigilance around that with ourselves. I think because I think there are so many little pitfalls or twists or
Mm,
things to be aware of in this, aren't there? And I think what you said at the beginning of of what you just said is really important. That we're not saying that change isn't possible. We're not saying that we haven't come through these things, because very clearly
mm.
we have. And I could say the same. 10 years ago, my life was really dysfunctional, and now it's not. Having said that, I think the work is always ongoing, isn't it? The door is always open to seeing more. So I think we're not saying the emerging out of it is somehow an ending. For me, in essence, that was like another beginning.
Yes,
So that there's an ongoing movement still happening, that this isn't a happily ever after in that sense.
sure.
There isn't an end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say, like, it depends what you think victory is, right? So if victory is overcoming, right, it's not that, right? So
Yeah,
you don't have a good marriage by overcoming your partner. You don't have good community relations by beating down the other side. Victory
yeah,
is integration, right? And one, I remember talking to Tim Freak about this one time, that we both, that's how we met at one of his groups, and I
yeah.
think I asked him how he, what did I ask him? It was something to do with how he maintained a sense of like confidence to get up and stand in front of a lot of people, when he would go and do something and like no one would turn up, and then he'd go and do the next thing and one man and his dog would turn up, and then no one. And it's like, how, do you not ever think like the universe is giving you, and this is like sort of, I don't want to portray him as remarkably unsuccessful. That doesn't happen to him today, but in the early days, it did,
Yeah, sure.
right? And I thought his answer was interesting, and that he said it's not about like overcoming that, because imagine if you didn't have that, right? Imagine if there wasn't a little voice in your head that said, are you sure you should be doing this? Like, that's how like gurus go crazy, and they think like, I should be teaching everyone in the world, so you need that bit of
Absolutely.
yourself, and you need the bit of yourself that says, oh, what's the point? And you need the bit of yourself that says, oh gosh, what does happen when you die? You need all these like bits, but they need to be integrated into a wholeness.
It absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think there's something also about what you're then doing. So, as you say, with what what emerged for Tim, or what is emerged for me, or for you, is is coming from a different place. actually, that for me now, say, having written the book, or the writing of the book, was something that wasn't, I mean, it's difficult to articulate, but it wasn't entirely personal. It wasn't the old formula, if you like, of I'm going to write a book about X in this way in order to do Y. It was something that was moving through me, or in some way there was an impulse to do it, but I was more at the service of it than it being at the service of me, so to speak. So I was giving my time and energy to its momentum, without really thinking about what that would mean for me, in a sense. So, and now it's out there. I've sort of left it to find its own way. I've not really done any what you might think of as marketing or anything like that. Um, so so I don't think, like you say, it's about having the confidence. I think what's driving us is a deeper meaning than that. So certainly on the few times I've spoken, I've felt anxious, I've felt uncertain, there's been doubt there about what I'm saying, but there's something deeper than those concerns going on. What's actually going on doesn't really care about my anxiety or my lack of confidence. That's irrelevant. So this is not about, as Tim often says, this is not about emerging as some Uber person,
Mm.
or some Uber version of ourselves, which is, all singing, all dancing. We're still our usual, bumbling selves in different ways. But there's something more important than that going on. Who cares, in essence, how we feel in a day-to-day way, when there's something of greater import or meaning that is being carried through us in some way? What's your sense of that?
Well, I have a sense of a deeper thing moving through, and what manifests in life, in the different things I do, coming out of that deeper sense. And I suppose that's the principal thing. And then there's mental energy around, should you be doing this? What about this? And then concern. So I suppose where my mind was, okay, well, what's the appropriate thing to do with those concerns? Okay, like ignore them,
Right.
keep
Yeah.
them down, fight them away, integrate, listen to them. If I listen
Yeah.
to them, how do they not consume me? But
Mm.
so is that what you're speaking to? That, like, if it's the case of like your book or any work you do, it's emerging from something that is beyond mental activity, essentially, or
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And I mean, what just to say, what we're talking about is very subtle, I think, isn't it? It's very, very nuanced. I think it's happening despite the mental energy, or despite the feelings. So in my case, for example, historically I had a lot of anxiety, and it's less than it was, but it's still around at various points in different ways. So I'm not saying that we don't tend to that, because I think there's something really important in tending to our current experience, whether that's anxiety or depression or mental energy, or whatever else. But that isn't the driving force. That's not what's driving things anymore. If I was
okay,
still being
yeah,
driven by my
yes,
anxiety, I wouldn't have done what I've done in the
mm,
last 7 or 8 years. What I do happens along with, the anxiety, if you like, is along for the ride. But that's not primary.
yeah. No, sorry, I see. Yeah,
What's primary is, it's almost like you could call it a creative urge, or a, an impulse to deeper meaning, or we could put different words to it. But that's what's most important to me now. So in a sense, my commitment almost has shifted from the day-to-day vagaries of my own inner mental and emotional states to something that feels deeper than, or we could position it differently. We could say it's prior to or deeper than that. That, yeah, my kind of ongoing
Yeah,
everyday states.
yeah. So I think for me, that opening up to this deeper being went sort of ran in parallel and in connection to the cleansing of the psyche. Okay, so
Yes,
initially I did enough of it to give me some stability to go through the psyche and the darkness, and then engaging with the psyche on the level of the psyche is quite a tormentuous thing, right? So what I found was, as
yeah,
I became more able to sink into that deeper being, there's more of a spaciousness in which the psyche can arise, and thoughts and concerns can be arise and say, okay, they're over there. There may be some wisdom in them, there may not, but they're not me. Essentially, that there's this
yeah.
deeper being which is there, which holds all this stuff, and that it's like it gives the psyche a spaciousness to sort itself out.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in the book, really, in essence, that's what my subtitle is from a journey from absence to presence. So certainly, like you say, trying to deal with the psyche on the level of psyche, when essentially, on some level, the deeper part of our being is absent, or we certainly we're disconnected from it. It is, as you say, really tortuous, isn't it?
Hmm.
My sense of the Dark Night is that it is the process in which we become present to ourselves, or we reconnect with soul or presence or our deeper being, and that's what allows, as you say, this the unraveling of the psyche to continue. That unraveling and reintegration happens not through effort or trying, but simply because it has that bigger space, so to speak,
Yeah,
in which to happen, and that we can simply be present to that and and accompany ourselves in those places. So I think there's a world of difference, as we know, between being with really difficult feelings like fear or anxiety or depression in the absence of that bigger space, to being with them in a sense with that,
yes,
together with the deeper being, is a very different experience, isn't
yeah.
it?
I think that was my journey over time, because I had this big experience that was back in 2007, and then I spent a lot of time trying to understand, like, well, what just happened and how can I replicate it for all the other things that I don't
Yeah.
particularly find wonderful in myself. And my initial attempts at that were quite, let's say, harsh. Like, they involved a lot of determination, and I'm going to see through this and see what's at the root of this. And the more I stepped into the kind of like jhana experience of expanded awareness, then the easier it became, and the more I took my foot off the gas pedal, if you like, and was able just to, like, okay, there's no, like, it when I'm observing something, like, I don't have the sense of like wanting to fix it or change it. It's like I'm just going to be with this thing. It might be there to my dying day and beyond. Um, that's not my intention. My intention is to allow whatever is within me to arise in this expanded state of awareness without necessarily a goal in mind, and just to come into relationship with that thing. And that's a much
Abs-
more pleasant and productive way of engaging with
uh,
oneself.
Completely. I mean, I love the fact that you brought in the word harsh, because
Mm.
I think there's so much harshness around, isn't there, and including in lots of spiritual practices. And that transition from harshness to something so much more gentle, so much kinder,
Mm.
that happens. Um, and I just want to say something about what you said about the expanded awareness, because I totally agree with you, and that can also sound like some kind of rather extraordinary or strange thing. I just want to say how ordinary and accessible
Mm.
that is, that we're not talking about some kind of completely altered state, we're talking about something that is very very here and now and immediate and ordinary in that that
Yes.
once we have a sense of being and being with, there's there's something very normal about it.
Yeah, well, maybe let's move on to that as a sort of conclusion then, because that's the, when you've been there, there's nowhere else to go. But just to comment on what you say about harshness there before we do, I think it was difficult for me to distinguish between harshness and focus, okay? Because I
Mm.
feel like what I recognized I lacked, and why my depression had not lifted sooner, was focus. That I touch on it and run away, touch on it and run away, because I didn't know what to do with it. And yeah, so then post that, I brought a lot of like determination and a harsh kind of focus into it, of like, is and so like if you were the manifestation of my psyche, it would be like I was interrogating you. So that's, why are you here? What do you want?
Yes.
Why
Yeah.
don't you shit? Um, as opposed to, like, say you can like play with a child for a long period of time and give it a lot of your attention, but you're not doing it in a way that's like harsh, right? There's like just an openness and a focused awareness, but not in a that sort of, yeah, harsh way. So that was a difficult distinction for me to make. It wasn't obvious to me at the start, right? And I had to come by that. And then
Yeah, absolutely.
with the expanded awareness, I think it's true, right? That if like 100 random people were to listen to this interview, this would be the bit that they go, oh, don't know where they've gone now. Expanded awareness? What's. So it is hard to language that in a way. It's, like describing color to someone who's not seen it or something. It can be a bit like that. And I do try and yeah, speak of it in a way that, it seems, because you're not speaking about a thing, right? You're speaking about the awareness in which things are arising. So you can't point to it and say laptop or microphone and say, oh yeah, that's what that is. But rather it's a bit more abstract in that sense. But yeah, like, indeed, accessible, right? Maybe takes time, but I think everyone can get some of it straight away. Maybe that's like focusing on the breath as it enters and exits the body for a minute, or maybe you have more of a natural flair of it and you can just like dive right into the depths of your being, or maybe that's something you have to study and go through step by step. And indeed, what I found working with people is that spectrum exists, right? So that some people just could like go straight into it and found really profound shifts very quickly would occur because they, when shown how to do it, they could naturally sink into the deepest parts of their being, and other people would completely lose that if they try, because it's too ephemeral. It's too like the thing that is looking is looking at the thing that is oh, it's all confusing, So but there's always like a gateway there, and that might be something more tangible like the breath, or one of these mindfulness or vipassana meditation. So yeah, and then it can develop from there. So I think it is like, on some level, it's accessible to anyone at any point.
Yeah, absolutely. My sense of it is that the easiest thing I could say is just come inwards. That other words like expanded consciousness or whatever tend to either, like you say, people will have an intuitive sense of what that is,
Mm,
or will set about it will set up um, another dynamic where people think there's something that they haven't got that they
mm,
need to get from outside in some way. But when we when we turn towards just whatever's here right now, that practice of noticing what's here. I'm breathing, I'm sitting, my legs bent, I've got some sensations in my body, I'm thinking, all of that stuff coming into that repeatedly. And I loved what you said about interrogating, because I can relate to that, that
mm.
we're not interrogating it, we're simply giving it some attention and tending to it. That has what naturally seems to flow from that is is access to the spaciousness, to the greater awareness. And I see this in my work with people all the time, that we stay with something of whatever description, often something in the body. And even by asking it simple questions like, what does this sensation want? Often what it wants is just to be allowed to be. The sensations are often saying like, can you just stop trying to get rid of me and give me a moment to be here, just as I am. Sometimes obviously the answer is a bit more complicated than that, but there's something about just being present to things, letting them be exactly as they are, which then opens out, things move, things change, things dissolve. There's a deeper sense of spaciousness there, which is us, you know, connecting with being. And within that, the more we connect with that, like you were saying, the less there's an urge to change or fix or do, the kinder things become. And I know for me, in my own inner experience, my judging voice used to be really harsh. There was a lot of like, oh my God, you're doing it again. What's wrong with you? Do this, do that. And now that inner voice is so much milder. Sometimes there's a bit of a sideways look and a kind of, oh, we're doing this now, are we? Oh, okay. you know but there's a kind of, yeah, a real sort of kindness in that, an allowance in that, which was all born out of the dark night. So I'm really grateful for that.
Okay, Fiona, I think that's a good place. Having actually, just to say, having done sessions of you, it's interesting how much consciousness does shift through the kind of inquiry process you lead, which is nothing like an interrogation and very much like an inquiry. Anyone thinking of. So I'll link to your the website where people can look at the sessions of, and to the specifically the Dark Night of the Soul book in the comment section on whatever
Thank
platform
you.
people are on. And thank you very much indeed for coming today. It's been this has been one of the more I would say insightful discussions for me in terms of like personal insight, I would say, and getting me to think about things on my feet in regard to how I'm conceptualizing these things myself. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm sure it's insightful for people out there too.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much appreciated it too. It's always really good to talk.